The rain came sideways that night, hammering the valley like something personal, like the sky had a grudge against every living soul below. Through the darkness, a woman moved chest deep in flood water, her arms burning as she pulled a rope tied to a small aluminum boat behind her. Inside the boat, three people clutched the sides with white knuckles, their faces lit only by brief flashes of lightning that split the mountain sky above Elk Ridge, Montana. The woman's name was Lena Caldwell. She was 35 years old, and 6 hours ago she had been putting her daughter to bed with a story about a rabbit who wasn't afraid of thunder. Now the thunder was real, and so was the water. She dragged the rope harder, her boots finding no grip on the submerged road beneath her feet. Somewhere ahead, through the sheets of rain, a single light burned high above the floodline. A house on stilts, the only structure still standing above the waterline in the entire town. A German shepherd stood at the top of the wooden staircase, barking into the storm, guiding her forward like a lighthouse made of muscle and sound. Lena pulled. The rope cut into her palms. The current tried to sweep her sideways, but she leaned into it with the stubbornness that only comes from a woman who has already lost too much to let the world take anything else. Behind her, someone in the boat called out through the rain. The words were swallowed by the wind, but it didn't matter. She already knew what she had to do 6 weeks earlier. The morning Beckett Garris arrived in Elk Ridge, the frost was so thick on the dirt roads that the tire tracks behind his truck looked like scars on the earth. A pale autumn sun hung low behind the mountains, too weak to burn through the mist that clung to the valley like a second sky. His truck was a faded blue Chevy at least 15 years old with a dented tailgate and a wooden toolbox bolted to the bed. The engine rattled slightly as he drove, but the sound was steady. The kind of rattle that meant a machine had been maintained by someone who understood it rather than someone who loved it. Beckett sat behind the wheel with the quiet stillness of a man who had learned long ago that most of life's dangers arrived before you heard them. He was 38, tall and lean, but built with dense functional strength earned from years of carrying heavy things across hostile ground. His face was angular, his jaw lined with dark stubble that looked 3 days past a razor, and a thin white scar crossed his left eyebrow at a slight angle, a mark he never explained to anyone who asked. His eyes were the color of creek water in winter, gray-green clear, constantly scanning. Beside him in the passenger seat sat a German shepherd named Boone. The dog was nearly 5 years old, broad through the chest and shoulders, with a thick black and tan coat and ears that stood tall and alert. Two pointed towers of attention that rotated independently towards sounds the human ear would never catch. Boone had served with Beckett during military operations overseas, trained in search and rescue, explosive detection, and the quiet art of sensing danger before it had a shape or a name. Since they left the service, the dog had never been more than 10 feet from Beckett's side, not out of command, but out of choice, the loyalty of a soldier who had already chosen his commander. The truck rolled past the center of Elk Ridge without slowing down. There wasn't much to slow down for. A gas station with two pumps and a handwritten sign advertising bait. A grocery store with cloudy windows and a stack of firewood for sale near the entrance. And a diner, the Ridley, with a faded red awning and a screen door that probably hadn't closed properly since the Clinton administration. Inside that diner, behind a counter worn smooth by decades of elbows and coffee mugs, stood Hank Ridley. Hank was 58, broad and solid, with thick gray hair combed straight back, and forearms that told the story of a man who had spent his life lifting things heavier than most people's excuses. He had a friendly face, naturally warm, but his eyes carried the careful habit of a man who had watched every stranger walk through his door for the last 30 years. He stood near the front window now, a dish towel draped over one shoulder, watching the blue truck pass through town without stopping. Across the counter sat Bess Halloran, a retired schoolteacher in her early 60s. Bess was tall and slender, with silver hair pinned neatly behind her head and sharp blue eyes that moved like a hawk tracking a mouse across a field. She had taught 3 generations of Elkridge children, and the precision of her gaze had never softened, not even after retirement. Hank tilted his chin toward the window. Someone new. Bess glanced up from her coffee, probably passing through. But the truck didn't pass through. It drove beyond the last houses past the end of the paved road and continued along a narrow dirt track that led toward the tree line where the forest began its slow climb into the mountains. The truck stopped at the edge of a wide clearing, a rough piece of land scattered with rocks, stubborn grass, and the stumps of trees that had been cut years ago and never replaced. Boone jumped down first. His paws hit the frozen ground without a sound, and immediately his nose went to work sweeping the air in long, steady pulls. His body moved through the clearing like a soldier clearing a room, methodical, unhurried, missing nothing. His ears turned toward the distant sound of the Black Fork River below the ridge, then back toward the forest, then toward the road behind them. Beckett stepped out and stood very still. He didn't look at the view. He didn't admire the mountains. He studied the ground beneath his feet the way a man studies a map before entering unfamiliar territory. The clearing sat on a slight rise above the valley floor, not high enough to be a hill, but enough to give a clear view of the town below and the river beyond it, enough to put distance between this spot and the nearest road, enough to matter when it mattered. He had chosen this place carefully. Over the next 2 weeks, something unusual began to take shape in that clearing. Instead of a standard Montana cabin, the kind built from heavy logs with a stone chimney and a covered porch, Beckett began unloading long bundles of thick wooden beams, treated posts, and cross-brace supports from his truck. Day after day, load after load, he drove the posts deep into the frozen ground, pounding them into footings he had dug by hand until his knuckles split and healed and split again. The structure that slowly rose between the pine trees looked like nothing Elkridge had ever seen. The floor of the house sat nearly 10 feet above the ground, supported by a grid of vertical posts anchored into deep concrete footings. Diagonal cross braces connected the legs at multiple points, creating a framework that looked strange but was engineered to flex under pressure rather than snap. From the road below, it looked like a house that had been lifted off its foundation by a giant hand and set down on wooden legs. It looked fragile. It looked foreign. It looked like a mistake. But beneath the visible structure, Beckett had built something no one could see. Between the support beams and the underside of the floor, he had created a system of hidden compartments, sealed storage spaces lined with waterproof metal sheeting, and accessible only through removable sections of the floorboards above. Inside these compartments, he stacked supplies with the quiet discipline of a man who had packed survival caches in places most people couldn't find on a map. Dried food in vacuum-sealed bags, canned meat with expiration dates 3 years out, emergency water containers, medical kits with field-grade supplies, thick wool blankets, rope, flashlights with extra batteries, a hand crank radio. The compartments locked flush into the floor, invisible from above or below. No one passing by would ever know they existed. Beckett worked alone every day, starting before dawn and finishing after dark. His movements had a rhythm to them, not learned from construction manuals, but from years of building things under pressure, in places where a mistake meant someone didn't come home. He never rushed. He never hesitated. He measured twice and cut once, and when he lifted a beam into place, he held it steady with a patience that suggested he had once held far heavier things. Boone lay beneath the rising structure each day, like a guard posted at a checkpoint, or watching every vehicle that passed on the distant road, every bird that crossed the clearing, every shift in the wind. Sometimes Beckett would pause his work and look down at the dog, and sometimes, without a word being spoken, Boone would look back up at him. And something passed between them in those moments that had no name but weighed more than language. They had seen things together that neither of them could forget. There had been a mission once, years ago, a disaster relief operation in a region where heavy rains had turned a river valley into a graveyard overnight. Beckett's team had arrived by helicopter at dawn to find an entire village submerged. The water had come while people slept. Houses built at ground level had filled in minutes. Families trapped inside had no time to climb, no time to run, no time to do anything but hold their children above the rising waterline until their arms gave out. Beckett had pulled 7 bodies from the mud that day. 3 of them were children. He never talked about it, not to counselors, not to commanding officers, not to anyone. But the lesson had burned itself into a part of his brain that no amount of silence could reach. And now every structure he built sat high above the ground, not because it looked right, not because it was comfortable, because he had seen what happened when the water came and no one was ready. That was the scar no one could see. The first person in town to stop and stare at the house was Hank Ridley, driving along the outer road on his way to pick up a delivery. He pulled his truck to the shoulder, stepped out, and folded his thick arms across his chest. He stood there for a full minute, looking up at the strange elevated frame rising above the clearing. "Well," he muttered to himself, scratching the back of his neck, "that's something." A few days later, Bess Halloran slowed her car on the same road, her sharp eyes studying the structure through the windshield. She watched Beckett lifting a beam into place while the large shepherd sat below like a statue carved from patience. She didn't stop, but she looked for a long time. And then the talk started. In a town as small as Elk Ridge, a new face was already news. A new face building a house on stilts at the edge of the forest was something else entirely. Within days, Beckett's strange project became the most discussed subject at the Elk Ridge Bar. A weathered wooden building across the road from the Ridley Diner. The bar smelled of cold jackets drying near the heater, spilled beer soaked into old wood, and the sharp tang of opinions that had been forming for decades. That particular evening, several locals leaned over the worn counter, watching early snow drift past the window. Virgil Coombs sat in his usual spot near the end of the bar. Virgil was 42, thick-set, with a reddish beard that looked like it had been grown more out of laziness than style, and a permanent sunburn across both cheeks from years of working under open hoods at the town's only auto garage. His hands were stained with grease that no amount of soap would ever fully remove, and his voice carried the blunt, confident tone of a man who believed his opinions were facts. "That thing looks like a stiff breeze could flatten it," Virgil said loud enough for the entire bar to hear. He shook his head and took a long drink. "Some kind of treehouse for grown men." A few people laughed. Beside him sat Dale Pruitt, a retired logger in his late 60s. Dale's shoulders were still broad despite his age, and deep wrinkles framed his weathered face like cracks in dried riverbed clay. He had spent 40 years cutting timber in the mountains above Elk Ridge, and he had the quiet authority of a man who had brought down trees older than the town itself. He didn't trust things that looked unusual, and he didn't trust people who built them. Just wait until the first real storm comes through, Dale said, sipping slowly from his mug. That structure will come apart faster than a rotten fence post. More laughter, more nodding. Probably some city fool who watched too many survival shows, someone added from a corner table. Within a week, the laughter had spread beyond the bar. People slowed their trucks on the road to gawk. Some stopped entirely, leaning against their doors with arms folded, watching the strange house rise higher above the clearing. A few took photos. Others simply shook their heads and drove on, adding their own version of the joke to the growing collection. The birdhouse, the treehouse, the mistake on stilts. Beckett never responded to any of it. He worked through the noise the same way he worked through everything else, with steady hands and a quiet focus that suggested the opinions of strangers ranked somewhere below the weather on his list of concerns. And Boone never flinched either. The dog lay beneath the structure each day, watching the distant trucks with calm, intelligent eyes, occasionally lifting his head when someone stopped too long, as if measuring the exact distance between curiosity and threat. Lena Caldwell first saw the house on a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn, walking home from the grocery store with Ruby holding her hand. Lena was 35, with shoulder-length brown hair that she usually kept tied back in a simple knot, and a face that carried the quiet tension of someone who had learned to hold everything together by holding everything in. She was slender, but not fragile, a woman whose strength showed not in her build, but in the way she moved through the world. Careful, deliberate, always watching for the next thing that might go wrong. 3 years earlier, her husband had been killed in a highway accident during a late-night drive home from work. A truck had crossed the center line on a curve outside of Missoula. The state trooper who came to her door at 2 in the morning had held his hat in both hands and couldn't meet her eyes. Since then, Lena had raised Ruby alone. She worked at the grocery store, kept her house clean, paid her bills on time, and spoke to her neighbors with the polite distance of someone who appeared fine when the truth was something different entirely. She had built a wall around herself and her daughter, not out of anger, but out of the simple understanding that the world could take everything from you in a single night, and the only defense was to need as little as possible from anyone. That afternoon, as she walked along the road near the edge of town, Ruby spotted the dog first. The little girl was 6 years old, with the same brown hair as her mother, and a gap-toothed smile that appeared without warning and disappeared just as fast. She pulled her hand free from Lena's grip and ran toward the clearing before Lena could stop her. "Ruby, wait!" But Ruby was already at the edge of the clearing, crouching beside Boone, with both hands extended. The German shepherd stood perfectly still, his tail moving once, twice, a slow, measured wag that suggested he had assessed the child and found her acceptable. Ruby touched the top of his head, and Boone lowered his ears slightly, leaning into the small hand. Lena reached them a moment later, slightly breathless, her instinct to protect already firing. But the dog was calm. More than calm, he was gentle in a way that seemed practiced, as if he had been around children before and knew exactly how to hold still. "He's so big," Ruby said, looking up with wide eyes. "He is." Lena agreed quietly, one hand on her daughter's shoulder, her eyes moving upward toward the raised house above them. Beckett stood on the platform above a beam resting across one shoulder, watching them without speaking. His expression was neutral, not unfriendly, but not inviting either, the face of a man who had grown comfortable with silence and saw no reason to break it for the sake of manners. She won't bother him. Lena said, her voice carrying the automatic apology of a single mother who had spent years making sure her child never inconvenienced anyone. He doesn't mind, Beckett said. His voice was low and even, a voice that didn't waste words on things that didn't require them. A pause stretched between them. Lena looked at the house again, at the tall posts disappearing into deep concrete footings at the cross. Braces locking the structure together at the elevated floor, sitting high above the ground like a platform designed for something she couldn't quite name. "Why so high?" she asked. The question was simple, but something in her voice suggested she was asking more than she realized. Beckett was quiet for a moment, looking out across the valley where the Black Fork River wound through the lower fields like a dark ribbon. "Because I've seen what happens when the water comes and no one is ready." The words landed in Lena's chest like a stone dropped into still water. She felt the ripple before she understood the reason. Because she had lived that sentence, not with water, but with grief. The night her husband died, everything had happened too fast. There had been no warning, no preparation, no chance to brace for the impact. She looked at the house one more time. Then she took Ruby's hand and walked back toward the road without another word. But the sentence stayed with her. It followed her home, sat with her through dinner, and was still there when she turned off the light beside her bed that night. "Because I've seen what happens when no one is ready." She understood that kind of building. Not the wood and the nails, the other kind. The kind you do inside yourself quietly, so that when the next terrible thing comes, you're still standing. 2 weeks after Beckett began building, Virgil Coombs did something that surprised no one who knew him. He filed a formal complaint with the Elkridge Town Council. The complaint was 3 pages long, handwritten in Virgil's blunt block letters, and it accused Beckett of multiple building code violations, potential safety hazards, and something Virgil called damage to the visual character of the community, a phrase he had likely copied from a county regulation booklet he found in the back of the auto garage. Gus Pemberton, the chairman of the town council, received the complaint on a Monday morning. Gus was 55, balding with round glasses and the cautious manner of a man who had spent his entire career avoiding decisions that might make anyone upset. He owned a small insurance office on the main road and had been on the council for 12 years, mostly because no one else wanted the job. Gus read the complaint twice, sighed heavily, and did what he always did when faced with a difficult situation. He agreed with whoever was standing in front of him. A notice was posted on the message board outside the grocery store the following day. Beckett Garris had 30 days to provide documentation proving his structure met county building codes, or the council would issue a demolition order. The notice was the talk of the town by noon. The town meeting was held on a Thursday evening in the back room of the diner. Hank Ridley had set up folding chairs in rows, and nearly 40 people filled the small space, which smelled of fried onions and strong coffee. Gus Pemberton sat at a folding table at the front, adjusting his glasses nervously. Virgil Coombs sat in the second row with his arms crossed and a satisfied expression on his sunburned face. Beckett was not there. He had not been invited, and no one expected him to come. Gus cleared his throat and read the complaint aloud in a voice that suggested he wished he were somewhere else. When he finished, he asked if anyone had comments. Virgil spoke first. "That structure is a hazard. It's an eyesore." And the man who built it hasn't said two words to anyone in this town since he got here. We don't know who he is or what he's doing up there." Several heads nodded. Dale Pruitt spoke next, his deep voice carrying easily through the room. "I've been cutting timber in these mountains for 40 years. I know what holds up and what doesn't. That thing he built doesn't look like anything that belongs in this valley." More nodding, more murmurs of agreement. Gus was about to move to a vote when a chair scraped against the floor near the back of the room. Lena Caldwell stood up. The room turned. People who hadn't noticed her sitting there now looked at her with the mild surprise reserved for someone who had been quiet so long that most of the town had forgotten she had a voice at all. Lena's hands were at her sides. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her chin was level and her eyes were clear. "You don't know anything about him," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made the room go still. "None of you do. You've spent 3 weeks laughing at a man who hasn't asked you for a single thing. He built something with his own hands on his own land. And instead of leaving him alone, you want to tear it down because it looks different." Silence. The kind that happens when a room full of people realizes they are being seen more clearly than they would like. Virgil leaned forward. "And what do you know about him that we don't?" Lena met his eyes without flinching. "I know that he's the only person in this town who seems to be preparing for something, while the rest of you are sitting around pretending nothing bad ever happens here." The words hung in the air like smoke. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Virgil shook his head and let out a small laugh, the kind designed to dismiss rather than amuse. "She's been a little off since her husband passed." He muttered to the man beside him, just loud enough for Lena to hear. Lena felt the words hit her like a slap. Her jaw tightened. Her hands clenched at her sides. But she did not sit down and she did not look away. She held Virgil's gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she turned and walked out of the room, her boots steady on the wooden floor, her spine straight, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Outside, the cold air hit her face, and she stopped on the sidewalk, breathing hard. Ruby was at home with a neighbor. The street was empty. The mountains stood dark and silent above the town. It was the first time Lena had stood up for anyone since the trooper came to her door 3 years ago. And standing there alone in the cold, shaking with a mix of anger and something she couldn't quite name, she realized that the trembling in her hands wasn't fear. It was something that had been asleep inside her for 3 years finally waking up. Late on a quiet afternoon near the end of the third week, when the shadows from the pine trees stretched long across the clearing, and the only sound was the distant murmur of the river below, Beckett walked behind the house carrying a shovel. The ground back there was uneven, littered with stones and the tangled roots of trees that had been cut down years before the clearing existed. Beckett had decided to deepen part of the foundation near the rear support posts, reinforcing the structure before the first heavy snows of winter arrived. He drove the shovel into the soil with steady, practiced strokes. The ground was cold and hard, resisting each thrust before giving way with a dry crunch. Once, twice, 3 times. Then the metal blade struck something that wasn't soil or stone. The sound was sharp and hollow, a metallic ring that echoed through the quiet clearing like a bell struck underground. The vibration traveled up the wooden handle and into Beckett's hands, and he stopped immediately. He pushed the shovel in again, more carefully this time. The same sound, hollow, deep, metal against metal. Beckett crouched and began clearing the earth away with his hands, pulling clumps of cold dirt and small rocks aside until the curved edge of something man-made appeared beneath the surface. It was round, metallic, covered in a thick layer of rust and hardened soil that suggested it had been buried there for a very long time. Boone was on his feet before Beckett's hands touched the metal. The German shepherd moved toward the spot with his body low and tense, his ears locked forward, every muscle visibly tight beneath his thick fur. A low growl rolled from deep in his chest, not anger but warning. Something beneath the ground had triggered an instinct in the dog that went deeper than training. Beckett continued clearing the dirt. Slowly, the full shape revealed itself. A circular metal hatch, roughly 3 feet across, set into a concrete frame that had been poured directly into the earth. The concrete was cracked with age, and the metal surface was covered in a patina of rust so thick it looked like the skin of something ancient. He wiped the surface with his sleeve, pushing away decades of grime. Beneath the rust, faint raised letters appeared stamped into the metal during a time when things were built to be found again. Flood Emergency Tunnel, 1953. Beckett stared at the words for a long time. He wedged the edge of his shovel beneath the hatch and applied pressure. The metal groaned but didn't move. Years of rust and settled earth had sealed it shut. He tried again harder, and this time the hatch shifted slightly, releasing a breath of cold, stale air from below. Through the narrow gap, he could see darkness, deep absolute darkness stretching downward into what appeared to be a large underground passage. The walls were lined with old concrete, cracked and stained with mineral deposits. Wooden support beams, most of them rotten and sagging, braced the ceiling at intervals. The tunnel was massive, wide enough for a man to walk through standing upright, and it angled downward away from the clearing toward the valley below. But it was blocked. Inside the entrance, collapsed wooden barricades and fallen debris had sealed the passage. Years of neglect had turned the emergency drainage system into a sealed tomb beneath the earth. Boone's growl deepened. The fur along his spine lifted in a ridge, and his eyes stayed fixed on the dark opening, as if he could see something down there that Beckett could not. For several seconds, neither of them moved. The forest was completely silent. Even the wind had stopped, as if the mountain itself were holding its breath. Then Beckett stood up. He looked around the clearing once, scanning the tree line and the distant road with the automatic precision of a man who had spent years checking sight lines before making a decision. No one was visible. The road was empty. The forest was still. Without a word, he pushed the dirt back over the hatch. Shovel after shovel of cold earth covered the rusted metal until the ground looked almost the same as before, just another patch of uneven soil at the edge of a Montana clearing. Boone watched him with his head tilted, slightly confused by the burial of something they had just uncovered. But the dog trusted the man, and the man had his reasons. What neither of them knew was that from far down the slope near a fallen pine trunk at the edge of the tree line, a 12-year-old boy had been watching everything. Caleb Jessup was thin and slightly awkward, with messy brown hair that always hung a little too long over his forehead, and a quiet, watchful expression that made him look older than 12. Since his father had packed a bag and driven away the year before, telling Caleb he would be back in a week, and then never calling again, the boy had developed the habit of wandering. After school, and sometimes during school, he rode his battered bicycle along the outskirts of Elk Ridge, exploring the woods, watching animals, sitting in places where no one would think to look for him. He had found the clearing weeks ago and had been coming back every few days, fascinated by the quiet man building the strange house and the large dog that seemed to understand everything without being told. Today he had arrived just in time to see the shovel strike metal. He had watched Beckett uncover the hatch, read the rusted letters, look inside, and then bury it again, as if it were a secret the earth had told him in confidence. Caleb said nothing. He sat behind the fallen trunk, barely breathing, until Beckett and Boone went back around the front of the house. Then he stood slowly, picked up his bicycle, and began pushing it down the slope toward the road. One thought circled in his mind as he walked. Why would someone bury something like that? Caleb didn't go home. He rode his bicycle to the only place that felt like it might listen, Lena Caldwell's front porch. Lena had always been kind to Caleb, in the way that people are kind when they recognize a version of their own loneliness in someone else. She had never asked him invasive questions about his father or his mother, or why he was always wandering around town when other kids were at home. She simply let him sit on her porch when he showed up, gave him a glass of water or a sandwich, and talked to him like he was a person instead of a problem. When she opened the door that evening and found him standing there with his bicycle leaning against the railing, she could see immediately that something was different. His eyes were wider than usual, and his hands were gripping the straps of his backpack like he was holding on to something that might escape. "Caleb, are you okay?" The boy looked at her for a moment, then spoke in a rush of words that tumbled out faster than he could organize them. He told her everything: the shovel hitting metal, the hatch, the rusted letters, the tunnel below, and the way Beckett had buried it all again carefully as if no one was supposed to know. Lena listened without interrupting. When Caleb finished, she stood very still on her porch, her arms crossed against the evening cold, looking toward the distant tree line where the clearing was hidden from view. "You're sure about what you saw?" Caleb nodded. Lena pressed her lips together. Then she told Caleb to go home, eat dinner, and not mention this to anyone else. The boy agreed, though she could see in his eyes that keeping a secret of this size was going to cost him. After he left, Lena stood on the porch for a long time. The evening air smelled of pine and cold river water, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called once and went silent. The next morning she drove her car to the edge of the clearing and found Beckett working on the railing of the elevated staircase. Boone raised his head as her car approached, then lowered it again when he recognized the vehicle. Lena got out and walked to the base of the stairs. She looked up at Beckett and said one sentence: "I know about the hatch." Beckett stopped working. He looked down at her with those gray-green eyes, and for a moment something shifted behind them. Not anger, not surprise, something closer to calculation, the rapid assessment of a man who was used to situations changing faster than expected. "The boy told you," he said. "It wasn't a question." "He trusts me," Lena said simply. Beckett set down the hammer and came down the stairs. He stood in front of her, and for the first time she noticed the full weight of his stillness. It wasn't the stillness of a man who had nothing to say. It was the stillness of a man who had learned that what you reveal and when you reveal it can mean the difference between survival and disaster. He told her. The tunnel was a flood emergency drainage system built in 1953 after a devastating flood in 1951 had killed 11 people in the valley. The Army Corps of Engineers had designed it to channel overflow from the Black Fork River through an underground passage that emptied into a natural basin several miles south of town. It had been used successfully during a flood in 1962, then gradually forgotten as decades passed without another major event. By the 1970s, the entrance had been buried, the records lost, and the tunnel had disappeared from the town's collective memory. But the tunnel was old. The concrete was cracking. The support beams were rotten. If someone opened it now during a minor storm or a routine high water event, the sudden pressure could collapse the weakest sections and destroy the entire system permanently. It has to be opened at exactly the right moment, Beckett said, when the river reaches its maximum pressure, not before. If the tunnel fails too early, there's no second chance. Lena studied his face. She was looking for something, though she wasn't sure what. Deception, perhaps. Or the reckless confidence that men sometimes mistake for competence. But she found neither. What she saw was the face of someone who understood that preparation wasn't paranoia. It was the only honest response to a world that didn't send warnings before it changed your life forever. "I won't tell anyone," she said. Beckett looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once. And in that nod, something was formed between them that was not friendship, and was not romance, and was not alliance, but was something older than all three. It was the understanding shared by two people who had both been broken by the world and had both chosen to keep standing. Not because standing was easy, but because the alternative was to sit down and wait for the next wave to finish what the first one started. Lena drove home. Ruby was waiting at the kitchen table, drawing a picture of a dog with ears like two triangles. "Mama, when can we see the big dog again?" "Soon," Lena said. She hung her coat by the door and stood at the window looking toward the edge of town, where the raised house stood barely visible against the dark tree line. The structure looked small from here, fragile against the massive backdrop of mountains and sky. But Lena knew something the rest of Elkridge did not. That house was not what it appeared to be, and neither was the man who built it. And neither, she was beginning to realize, was she. The rain arrived on a Monday, 3 weeks after Beckett Garris had driven his first post into the frozen ground at the edge of the clearing. It came quietly at first, the way most dangerous things begin. A soft gray drizzle that darkened the dirt roads and beaded on the windows of the Ridley Diner like sweat on cold glass. The mountains disappeared behind low clouds that pressed down over the valley, as if the sky was slowly lowering a lid over Elkridge. No one paid much attention. Rain in autumn was as common as gossip in a small town, and the people of Elkridge had lived through enough rough weather to know the difference between a nuisance and a threat. Or so they believed. By Wednesday, the drizzle had thickened into a steady downpour. The dirt roads turned to mud. The gutters along the main street overflowed, sending small rivers of brown water across the sidewalks. The Black Fork River, normally a calm and predictable current winding through the lower valley, began to swell. Its color changed from clear mountain green to a muddy, restless brown, and the sound of it grew louder, audible now from the center of town, a low, constant roar like a machine running somewhere underground. By Friday, the rain had not stopped for a single hour in 5 days. Inside the Ridley Diner, Hank Ridley stood near the radio mounted beside the kitchen doorway, drying a coffee mug with slow mechanical movements while he listened. The signal crackled through bursts of static, cutting in and out as the storm interfered with the reception, before a weather announcer's voice broke through, clearly enough to hear. Flash flood warning issued for the Bitter Creek and Black Fork Valley corridor. Local authorities are advising residents in low-lying areas to prepare for potential flooding. River levels are expected to reach their highest point in nearly 30 years. Residents should monitor conditions and be prepared to evacuate on short notice. Hank set down the mug. His thick grey eyebrows drew together and the lines around his mouth deepened. At the counter, Sheriff Colton Marsh sat with both hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. Marsh was 43 tall and square-jawed, with short brown hair cut close to the scalp and grey eyes that carried the steady calm of a man who had spent 15 years dealing with emergencies that most people only read about in newspapers. He didn't panic easily. He didn't panic at all. But the slight tightening at the corners of his eyes told Hank that the warning had registered. 30 years. Marsh said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. That river hasn't moved like that since 91. Hank leaned against the counter. You think it's real this time? Marsh looked out the window at the rain falling in thick silver sheets across the parking lot. The puddles had connected into a single shallow lake that stretched from the diner's front steps to the edge of the road. I think we should stop hoping it isn't, the sheriff said, while the town listened to weather warnings and debated whether the forecasters were overreacting. Lena Caldwell had already started preparing. She began quietly the way she did most things. On Saturday morning, after dropping Ruby at school, she drove to the grocery store where she worked and bought extra supplies with money she had been saving in a jar above the refrigerator. Canned vegetables, peanut butter, crackers, bottled water, batteries, a small first aid kit from the bottom shelf near the back of the store. At home that afternoon, she packed a waterproof backpack with the things that couldn't be replaced. Ruby's birth certificate, their social security cards, the insurance papers for the house, a small photo album with pictures of Ruby's father, the only images her daughter would ever have of him. She sealed the backpack shut and placed it near the front door. Then she walked next door to the house where Margaret Waverly lived, a widow in her 70s, who had been Lena's closest neighbor since she moved to Elk Ridge. Margaret was sitting in her living room watching the rain through the window with a cup of tea balanced on her knee. Margaret, have you thought about what you'd take if you had to leave quickly? The older woman looked at her with mild confusion. Leave, where would I go? I don't know yet, Lena said, but I think you should have a bag ready. Margaret smiled the way people smile at a child who is afraid of a noise in the dark. Sweetheart, this town has been here 100 years. A little rain isn't going to change that. Lena tried two more neighbors that afternoon. Both responded with the same polite dismissal. One laughed softly. The other patted her arm and told her not to worry so much. She stopped trying after that, but she didn't stop preparing. That same weekend up at the clearing, Beckett Garris moved through his own preparations with the speed and focus of a man following a checklist written in a language only he could read. He checked every beam and support brace beneath the house, testing each joint with his hands, pressing his weight against the cross braces to feel for any flex or weakness. He tightened bolts that didn't need tightening. He reinforced connections that were already strong. The habits of a man who understood that redundancy wasn't waste, it was insurance. He dragged the small aluminum boat from behind the woodpile and secured it to one of the main support posts with heavy rope positioned so it could be launched into moving water within minutes. He tied thick safety lines along both sides of the wooden staircase, knotting them at intervals so that anyone climbing in heavy rain would have something to grip. Then he opened the hidden compartments beneath the floorboards and began moving the supplies upward into the main room of the house. Metal containers of dried food, sealed water canisters, medical kits, emergency blankets, rope, tools. Everything was stacked against the interior walls in a pattern that was both organized and deliberate, each item placed where it could be reached quickly in the dark. Boone circled the clearing below with restless energy, his nose lifting toward the wind every few seconds, his ears rotating toward the distant sound of the river. Occasionally the dog stopped and stared toward the valley, his body rigid, locked on something only he could sense. Then he would let out a single sharp bark toward the tree line, as if warning an invisible enemy that this ground was taken. On Sunday evening, as the rain intensified and the sky darkened 2 hours earlier than it should have, Lena drove up to the clearing. Beckett was securing the last safety line when he heard her car. He looked down from the staircase and saw her standing in the rain without an umbrella, her jacket already soaking through her brown hair plastered to the sides of her face. "It's getting worse," she said. "I know." The town doesn't believe it. I know that too. She stood there for a moment, rain running down her face, and then she said something that surprised both of them. "What can I do?" Beckett studied her. He had spent 20 years reading people under pressure, distinguishing between those who would hold steady when things got bad and those who would freeze. The distinction had nothing to do with size or strength or training. It was something in the eyes, a willingness to see the situation clearly and act anyway, even when the situation was terrifying. He saw it in Lena now. "If it floods," he said, "this house will be the only high ground. People will need to get here. Some of them won't be able to make it on their own." Lena nodded once, a nod that doesn't ask for further explanation. She drove home, picked Ruby up from the neighbor who had been watching her, and packed a second bag. This one was larger. Warm clothes for both of them. Ruby's favorite stuffed animal, a worn gray rabbit with one ear longer than the other. Extra socks, a flashlight. She set both bags by the front door and sat at the kitchen table listening to the rain hammer the roof above her head. Ruby came and climbed into her lap. "Mama, is the rain going to stop?" Lena held her daughter close. "It will," she said, "eventually." But even as she said it, she wasn't sure she believed it. 3 days before the flood, Gus Pemberton called an emergency meeting of the Elk Ridge Town Council. The meeting was held at the diner again, and this time the back room was packed so tightly that people stood along the walls and leaned in through the kitchen doorway. The rain had been falling for over a week, and the mood in town had shifted from casual indifference to a low, uneasy tension that hung in the air like the smell of wet wood. But Gus had not called the meeting to discuss the weather. He stood at the front of the room with a single sheet of paper in his hand, adjusting his round glasses with the nervous habit of a man who wished the paper would disappear. "I've received a renewed petition from several residents," Gus began, his voice already wavering, "regarding the unlicensed structure at the North Clearing." A few people shifted in their seats. Some looked confused. Others, specifically Virgil Coombs, looked satisfied. Virgil sat in the second row, his thick arms crossed, his reddish beard still beaded with rain from the walkover. He had spent the last week collecting signatures from anyone willing to listen, arguing that the approaching storm made Beckett's raised house even more dangerous. "That thing is a liability," Virgil said, not waiting for Gus to finish. "When the wind picks up, those stilts are going to snap and send the whole mess tumbling down the slope. Someone could get hurt. We need to act now." Gus cleared his throat. The original notice gave Mr. Garris 30 days to provide documentation. However, given the current weather conditions and the concerns raised by multiple residents, the council has decided to accelerate the timeline. He paused, glanced around the room, and then delivered the decision he had clearly rehearsed in front of his bathroom mirror that morning. The demolition deadline has been moved up. Mr. Garris has 5 days to comply or the structure will be removed. The room buzzed. Some people nodded. Others frowned. Hank Ridley stood behind the counter with his arms folded, his expression unreadable. Then a chair scraped against the floor near the middle of the room. Lena stood up for the second time. This time she didn't tremble. This time her hands hung steady at her sides, and her voice carried a clarity that cut through the noise of the crowded room like a blade through wet paper. You're going to tear down the only structure in this town that sits above the flood line, she said. 5 days from now, while the river is rising. The room went quiet. Look outside, Lena continued. Look at the water on the roads. Listen to the river. You can hear it from here, and it's getting louder every day. The weather service is telling you to prepare, and instead of preparing, you're sitting in this room arguing about a house that hasn't hurt anyone. She turned and looked directly at Virgil Coombs. If that flood comes and the water reaches the streets, where exactly are you planning to go? Virgil's jaw tightened. That house is not a shelter. It's a pile of sticks on legs built by a man none of us know. And this meeting is a pile of words spoken by men who are too proud to admit they might be wrong. The silence that followed was so complete that the only sound was the rain beating against the diner's tin roof. A steady, relentless drumming that seemed to punctuate Lena's words with evidence. Gus Pemberton blinked several times behind his glasses. He looked at Virgil. He looked at Lena. Then he did what Gus Pemberton always did when faced with conflicting pressures. He split the difference. The demolition order will be postponed until the storm passes, he said carefully. But the order stands. Once conditions improve, the structure must be brought into compliance or it will be removed. It was a coward's compromise, and everyone in the room knew it. But it was enough for now. Lena sat down. Across the room, Bess Halloran caught her eye and gave the smallest of nods, the kind that means more between women than most handshakes mean between men. After the meeting, as people filed out into the rain, Dale Prewitt lingered near the door. The old logger stood with his worn coat collar turned up against the weather, his deep-set eyes watching the crowd disperse. He had been quiet during the meeting, which was unusual for a man who normally had an opinion about everything that happened in Elkridge. But something had been working on Dale's mind for days, something he hadn't been able to shake. It had started 3 days earlier when Caleb Jessup had been talking to another boy outside the grocery store. Dale had been walking past close enough to overhear a few words that had stopped him in his tracks. A hatch, metal, buried behind the new house. Something about a tunnel. The words had triggered a memory so old that Dale had almost forgotten it existed. He was 8 years old, sitting on his father's knee in front of a wood stove, listening to the old man talk about the flood of 51. 11 people dead, the valley underwater for 3 days. And afterward, the government had sent engineers to build something underground. A drainage tunnel, his father had said. Big enough to walk through standing upright. Built to carry the river away if it ever broke its banks again. But that was more than 60 years ago. Dale had never seen the tunnel himself. He had assumed it was just one of those stories old men told to make the past sound more important than the present. Now he wasn't sure. After the crowd thinned, Dale walked to his truck, but he didn't drive home. He drove instead to the small house near the river where Lena Caldwell lived. She opened the door with Ruby on her hip, her expression shifting from surprise to caution as she recognized the old man standing on her porch. Dale, I heard something, he said, his weathered face more serious than she had ever seen it. About a tunnel under the ground up near that clearing. Lena's hand tightened on the doorframe. I need to know if it's true, Dale said. Because if it is, I think I know what it is, and I think it changes everything. Lena was quiet for a long moment. The rain fell behind Dale in a gray curtain, and somewhere down the road the river sounded closer than it should have. Then she stepped aside and let him in. She told him what Caleb had seen. She told him what Beckett had explained. The tunnel built in 1953 after the flood of 1951. The collapsed barricades inside. The need to wait for maximum water pressure before opening it. Dale listened without interrupting, his large hands wrapped around the coffee mug Lena had placed in front of him. When she finished, he sat very still, staring at the dark surface of the coffee as if reading something written there. My father told me about that tunnel when I was a boy, he said quietly. I thought it was just a story, something from another time. He looked up at her. But it's real. It's real, Lena confirmed. Dale Pruitt had come to that porch as a skeptic. He left it as something